Welcome to the City Club Forum, a citadel of free speech since 1912. I'm Eleanor Ramsay Barrett, treasurer of the City Club. Our speaker today is Mrs. Rosa Parks. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, a seamstress and respected citizen of Montgomery, Alabama, quietly refused to give her bus seat to a white man. That episode triggered the Montgomery bus boycott and signaled the end of segregation in the South. Rosa Parks was born in Tuskegee, Alabama. Her family moved to Montgomery when Rosa was 11 years old. In 1931, Rosa married Mr. Raymond Parks. She and her husband were both longtime activists in the pursuit of civil rights, long before it was popular. Both were involved in voter registration drives throughout the South. In 1955, when Rosa Parks was secretary and youth director for the Montgomery branch of the NAACP, she was preparing for a major youth conference when she was arrested. Since that historic day in Montgomery, Mrs. Parks has continued her work in the civil rights movement. She has received many awards and citations for her outstanding contributions and has received an honorary doctorate degree from Shaw College in Detroit, Michigan. In 1976, Mayor Coleman Young of Detroit renamed one of its city's main thoroughfares Rosa Parks Boulevard. In 1978, the National Committee for Rosa L. Parks was established to build a museum and conference center in order to study the civil rights movement. Currently, Mrs. Parks serves as assistant to Congressman John Conyers, Jr. Due to the courage of this noble woman, many black leaders, such as Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., Atlanta's Mayor Andrew Young, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Coretta Scott King have emerged to change the course of America. This delicate, quiet woman has come to be a symbol of courage for all Americans as she demonstrated to the world the power of simple words, those words being, "I am not going to move." Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Mrs. Rosa Louise Parks.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and to the officers, President Mr. Davis, and other officers and members and friends of the Cleveland City Club. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you today, and for your warm reception and for your hospitality. I was enjoying a lunch, but it seemed like I was a little bit slow in getting to eat, but I hope that you will bear with me, and I will not hold you long here as a speaker, because I was just telling someone that I'm not a professional lecturer and I'm not a speaker, but people have put me in this position since 1955, and strange as it may seem, before 1955, from I guess as far back as I could talk and think about not being a free person, I was very vocal, but people didn't care to listen. They thought I was insane, and that there was no such thing as defying the white power structure in the Deep South, in Alabama, especially the cradle of the Confederacy in the heart of Dixie. I felt that if we were in a free America, in a free country, that all should be free and no skin color, a national origin, a religious belief, nothing should prevent one person from having the opportunity of another. As was said, in 1932, I married Raymond Parks, and when I first met him, it seemed that he was the first man I had met since the death of my grandfather at the age of 10 in Pine Level, Alabama, that I saw in him a man who was not ready to accept what we call buying and scraping and yesing because of race. He was very much concerned with the young black boys who were being railroaded to the electric chair because of their color, I would have to say it that way. And most of the time we spent together was talking about freedom and freedom of religion, freedom to vote, all freedom for everybody. So after this case passed off the scene, and a few years later I became interested. In fact, I was always interested in NAACP or any freedom organization, but it was extremely dangerous, and he didn't encourage me. But a few years in the early 1940s during World War II, I did accept the position as secretary of the Montgomery branch. And a few years after that, I assumed this responsibility because of the young people, and I felt that they should be guided and directed into knowing how and what to do and how to conduct themselves as we tried very diligently to become free people. And this was very difficult because most of the teachers and especially the parents discouraged their youngsters and didn't want them to participate or join the NAACP. They didn't mind them paying the membership, but they didn't want them to actively participate in writing to the congressman and challenging segregation locally, such as going into the all-white library and asking for books that would refuse them unless they would promise to go across town to a residential home that was set up as a branch library, the colored branch. And when the young men were returning from the war in World War II, many of them, including my brother, my only brother, who had served almost 4 years in the war and was discharged honorably after traveling, you would say, around the world, leaving the APO in New York and returning in the Pacific. He was quite upset because I think while he was away and knowing the freedom such as it was there, he felt that those of us at home had somewhat failed those on the war front. He left and went to Detroit, where he was raising a young family. My oldest nephew is here and his wife, so they live in this area in Shaker Heights. It has been a constant source of unrest, unhappiness. When the 1954 Supreme Court decision was handed down to end racial segregation in the public schools, I felt a ray of hope. However, that was soon dashed because we couldn't find enough parents, or very few, in Montgomery to sign the petition to put before the Board of Education. We had a few, and some of them were somewhat intimidated, so therefore the schools remained segregated as ever. Even though our young council of the NAACP, the youth council, was not very strong with members. A few of them, the young president in particular, and I think 3 or 4 young girls, would take some means, writing letters, going to places, and not accepting the really insulting denial because of color. And on March 2nd of 1955, there was a young girl named Claudette Colvin who was arrested on the bus for refusing to stand up, and she was taken off the bus bodily by 3 policemen and thrown into jail, charged with disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and assault and battery. While she weighed about 90 pounds, I don't know how much those 3 policemen weighed, but those are the charges. They did not charge her with racial segregation on the buses. They used the other charges. And on December 1st, when I was arrested and placed in jail because of my refusing to stand up on the auto as a driver for one white man to sit down while 4 of us, a man in the seat next to me and next to the window, had the aisle seat, and the 2 women across the aisle. So this would mean that adding to the crowd of people in the back all the way up to where we were sitting, plus the 4 of us would still have to stand or remove ourselves from the bus. I'm sure the driver didn't care which we did. And when I refused and was taken to jail, and shortly after bond was made for me and my trial was set for December 5th, 1955. And on December 5th, we did get up and start looking, and people were just staying off the buses in large, large numbers. On the evening of the same December 5th, there was a meeting at the Holt Street Baptist Church, just about the capacity of 1,500 people, seating capacity in the church, but there were thousands of people. The church was as full as any building could ever be, because I could almost not get in. Somebody pulled me one way, and finally I did get in the meeting. And there were thousands on the outside. Loudspeakers were set up to hear the proceeding of the meeting. The people were so enthusiastic, and they were so willing, that when a vote was taken, that was after the speakers, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Abernathy, Mr. E.D. Nixon, and many, many people who spoke. For once, I did not have to speak, and I didn't speak. They told me I had said enough, but evidently I hadn't, because people are still calling on me to tell this story over and over again. There was not one dissenting vote as far as the voices could be heard for blocks away against our remaining off the buses. And from then on, with the election and the choosing of Dr. Martin Luther King as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and the transportation set up a carpool. Of course, before the transportation committee was formed, the black cab companies in Montgomery were willing to take people, even if they didn't have the cab fare. They would take whatever they give them, a dime. Bus fare, incidentally, was 10 cents at that time. But the city officials threatened to revoke their license and put them out of business. But there were private car owners among the black people, because there were some among us who were able to own cars, and they very generously donated the use of their cars. If they couldn't drive themselves, they'd get someone else to drive. So the carpool was set up, and it worked very successfully in spite of arrest and harassment. And each time the city officials would form some rules or try to get us back on the buses, and we would find it out and not go back, it always strengthened our determination to remain steadfast and united. We use the churches, many churches, open their doors for mass meetings. Sometimes we have 3 or 4 mass meetings at different churches, and the officials, Reverend King and some of the others who worked with him, would go from one church to the other. And this attracted so much attention that people came from everywhere, from all over the country. They sent money, sent clothing, sent shoes. We had more shoes in Montgomery in our little storehouse that I think they had in the stores downtown. And we had clothes, food, and everything. And they sent enough money to purchase several station wagons through the churches. All of this went to make up what was considered the first mass movement in the South for freedom in a nonviolent and peaceful way. Even though there were many who did have their own weapons, but Dr. Martin Luther King preached love for your enemy and accepting the punishment, and many didn't agree with it, but because there was no other way at that time, because we actually did not have the wherewithal to take weapons and go against the power structure. But our persistence, our patience, our faith, and our belief in each other. And another thing I would like to also mention was that during that period, that year, that we remained off the buses, black-on-black crime was diminished very noticeably. And as we passed through that era and went to the other movements, the school, the young people in the school sit-ins, Birmingham, Albany, and many other areas of the South, and then moved to the North, we find that racism is ever alive, and it will stay with us as long as it is within ourselves. And it is my hope and my desire that there will be a time as we bring up our youngsters to teach them to respect themselves, to respect authority, and to face the world without prejudice, without hatred, and to learn of our heritage and to be ever aware and concerned about our fellow man. And I feel that this is going to be the answer, because we certainly, with the threat of war facing us and the threat of annihilation of the world through greed and violence and crime, that those of us of goodwill would ever increase our efforts. That is why I'm here today. I want to spread the message of goodwill, of peace, justice, and the opportunity, freedom of opportunity to fulfill our potential. And if we do this as we bring up the young, I'm very concerned about youth and how they are being treated by parents, teachers, and others in authority, that we will grow and be strong as we develop those who come after us. I thank you for your attention, and I appreciate your kindness listening to me, and I hope to return again, because I feel very close to this city, especially since I have some close relatives here, and I will be coming back again, and it has been wonderful. I've enjoyed every moment of my stay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Parks. Today at the City Club, we are listening to Mrs. Parks discussing the past and the future of the civil rights movement in America. In just a moment, we'll turn to our traditional question period, but first, a few announcements. Next week at the City Club, we will have 1, 2, and 3 special programs. On Tuesday, we shall present the final seminar program in our Advancing Cleveland series with a panel of experts presenting their ideas of where we go from here in the revitalization of Cleveland. Participating will be Stephen Minter, Director of the Cleveland Foundation, David Sweet, Dean of the College of Urban Affairs of Cleveland State University, William Bryant, President of the Greater Cleveland Growth Association. Please make your reservations today for this program. Then on Wednesday of next week, we are presenting a special midweek forum featuring Lynn Glenn, who is the daughter of Senator and Mrs. John Glenn, who, as a member of the Cambodian Crisis Committee, has just returned from a study tour of Southeast Asia and will be reporting on the refugee problem there and the political unrest. This, excuse me, this program will be taped for rebroadcast on our national radio network of 129 stations. On Friday, 1 week from today, we shall present our regular forum with our speaker being Mr. Neil Pierce, syndicated columnist with the Washington Post, who will conclude our Advancing Cleveland series by speaking on the reborn American city. What next? Again, please make your reservations today. Today, as always, we have students with us who are participating in our Living Seminars program, which we sponsor in cooperation with the Cleveland Board of Education. With us now are students from the following schools: Shaw, Law and Public Service, James Ford Rhodes, Warrensville, St. Joseph High School, Charles F. Brush High School, Laurel High School, John Adams, New Direction Program in Solon, Ohio, Padua, and Max S. Hayes. Will you please stand and accept our welcome? Thank you. They will be meeting with Mrs. Parks for their own seminar right after our forum here. Now for your questions. We have 2 microphones, one in the front with Alan Davis, and one in the back of the room with Bob Conrad. Raise your hands to be recognized. Questions, please? Mrs. Parks, you want to come to the podium?
Ms. Parks, would you be good enough to tell us a little bit more about Mr. E.D. Nixon, the forgotten man of the movement, and his relationship to you and to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.?
Mr. E.D. Nixon is still living in Montgomery, Alabama, and he is a retired sleeping car porter for the Pullman Company. And the last time I saw him, I think it was in 1982 in Ann Arbor when he came back for a seminar or conference of the Civil Rights Movement. I have not spoken with him recently, but he is still around and he remained active for a long time.
Some people surprisingly don't even know who Mr. E.D. Nixon is.
Well, Mr. Nixon was also the first person who was notified of my being arrested, and then he could not get a straight answer from. In fact, they just told him at the jail when he called to find out if I was arrested that it was none of his business. And he contacted Attorney Clifford Durr, who made the call, and they did acknowledge that I was in jail. So it was Mr. Nixon and Mr. and Mrs. Durr who came to the jail while my husband was trying to get another friend to make bond for me, but they were the persons who had me released from jail. And the morning of December 5th, the following Monday morning, was decided for my trial date because Mr. Nixon wanted to be present, and he had to go out on his run on his job and would be coming back, I think, Sunday evening, so he'd be there Monday morning.
Mrs. Parks, have you been called upon by public officials to give advice and testimony to places like the congressional committees? And if so, can you tell us about those experiences?
I mean, have I spoken before Congress?
Yes.
No, I never have.
But what about other elected officials? Do they come to you for any counsel or advice? Presidents on down?
No,
None.
I don't think so. I work in the office of Congressman John Conyers, and I've already been in his office 20 years, and he does give me credit for having been a help to him during his congressional and political career. Oh, I've met many candidates and who would request my endorsement when they're running for office. But right now, I don't recall anybody asking any advice of me. Not that I can remember at this moment.
Mrs. Parks, could you tell us something of the humiliation and the degradation which you people must have felt during those years when you had to get up and give your seat to a white man?
Well, I think there's actually no other feeling like it, and I had just made up my mind as far back as in the early 1940s. 1943, this same bus driver evicted me from the bus, not because a seat was involved, but because when I paid my fare in the front door and did not get off the bus and go around and try to squeeze in the back door, he wouldn't permit me to ride the bus. And you actually can't describe it really, because it just, if you had any thoughts or care, I'm sure that even those who felt that they had to submit to this did not like it, but for fear of reprisals or worse treatment or violence, we just didn't know what to expect, because even I, as I sat there and waited to be arrested, didn't know whether I would be manhandled or hurt physically or what would happen. But I was willing to take the chances because I did not see my obeying the driver as being anything. That the driver didn't make the expressions. He said, "Y'all make it light on yourselves." But I did not feel like it was making it light at all to obey his. It would have been good if the 4 people would have remained seated then. There were 4 of us going to jail. So I've always appreciated the fact that after the movement began, whenever, instead of one person alone being arrested, whenever people went to jail in numbers. And that was one of the things that made our movement so very significant, because we were banding together on a common cause. As long as we were divided and fearful, we were defeated.
Mrs. Parks, I have not a question, but on behalf of my church, Bible Ways Temple of Prayer, and Pastor Ricardo Nichols, I, as a black woman, am so thrilled to be here, and I just wanted to say thank you, because if it had not been, excuse me, everyone, but if it had not been for you and others like you, Martin Luther King, we would not be in the positions that we are. And I don't want to take this opportunity and not to say thank you. That's all. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you very much. So many of the younger people, some who were babies or some who were not born at that time, do not appreciate the suffering. Many of them don't know it, and then many feel that they just can take whatever opportunities they have for granted and make poor use of what is before them. But if we could only teach the young that they do not have to suffer the humiliation that we did if they would make the best opportunities that they have. But if we fail to use the freedom that we have, we will certainly lose it, and it would be lost much faster than it was gained because of the long struggle to gain the rights that we do have. But they can be eroded and destroyed very easily and very quickly by the powers that be.
Mrs. Parks, since you have been so successful in helping gain civil rights, what suggestions can you give both for furthering civil rights, since there still is a long way to go both in this country, and also what suggestions do you have for South Africa, where tribes are divided and the government is dividing black people further? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would say that I do not consider myself so successful because as long as we have problems, we have not reached the peak of success. And I am very concerned and very interested in the freedom wherever it is impaired or wherever it is denied. And South Africa is a focal point at the time. And I certainly feel that all people of goodwill would demonstrate by action and form organizations and work towards the freedom along with the South Africans themselves. Now, those of us on the outside of South Africa cannot bring about that freedom, but it has to be, just like in Montgomery, it had to be the black people of Montgomery and those other people of goodwill to take action against the oppression that we were going through. And the many South Africans, and there are many who are working in this regard, Bishop Tutu and several of the people who are now, I think it was Mandela, and several of the people who are now in prison. The bishop is not in prison, but he is outspoken for freedom. If there would be a movement to join in, I'm sure that there will be a change made.
Mrs. Parks, some people question the nonviolent approach that Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King took by saying that it can only work against an enlightened enemy. But if you are facing a person like Hitler, for example, would a nonviolent approach, peaceful and loving your enemy would work? What do you think about those critics who criticize the nonviolent approach?
Well, you're going back to Hitler. I remember, I don't have any answer for that. But the only thing I can say that if we are weak and don't have the weapons, it is committing suicide to try to react in a violent way. And if this is something that each individual will have to answer for himself. I cannot tell another person what to do and what not to do whenever they're faced with a conflict.
Ms. Parks, you go down, and this is Women's History Week. You go down in history with such women as Lucinda Mott, Sojourner Truth, Martin Bethune, Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, women who have changed history. Do you have a special message for women?
The only message I have for women and people, I would ask that we examine ourselves and how we think and how we feel about other people. We'd find a means to respect ourselves and those with whom we come in contact, whether it be people in the family, husbands, wives, or whatever the relationship may be. And if you show them respect and love, then I'm certain that it will spread abroad. I do not feel that any firm foundation of strength can be built on dissension, misunderstanding, hate, and malice. Any of the negative emotions can build a strong relationship. I think love, faith, understanding, and faith. Hope, and hope for the future is the best that we have. And of course, working together and not against each other. I often hear Jesse Jackson saying, Reverend Jesse Jackson saying that we must turn to each other and not against each other. I think that's putting it as well as I can.
Mrs. Parks, Mr. Clarence Pendleton, the chairman of President Reagan's Civil Rights Commission, earlier this week said that the leaders of various civil rights organizations like the NAACP are engaging in reverse racism and are doing a disservice to the civil rights movement. Could you comment on Mr. Pendleton's remarks?
I don't know how I can comment on his remarks, but I certainly feel that all of this service that was done to black people over the hundreds of years, everything from chattel slavery and even the emancipation had its drawbacks, because when Lincoln freed the slaves in 1863, it was without giving them any means of supporting themselves. Many had to just stay where they were. And of course, we remember the Reconstruction era and how that turned out with, and the Jim Crow laws and all of that. So I do not think that anybody should complain about black people supporting black people or anybody else or people of goodwill supporting them and giving them the opportunity that had been denied over the hundreds of years.
Mrs. Parks, when you were arrested, members of your community could have thought that it was your individual misfortune or even your own personal foolishness that led to your arrest, but they clearly didn't. Can you say something about what made your community ripe to get out and make the changes that people made in their minds, in their community organization? Why were people so ready to take action?
First of all, I can somewhat compare the arrest in 1955 with the time when I was evicted from the bus in 1943 by the same bus driver. And the only thing that people back then in the early 40s said that she must be crazy. Why don't she go on and do what he said, go on and get in the back door? And in 1955, there had been this little bit more than a decade of years, and there had been many changes in people's thinking. The return of the veterans home and after World War II had ended, because there was a movement of young veterans, black veterans in Birmingham, Alabama, to get registered to vote. There was the Supreme Court decision in 1954 to outlaw racial segregation in school. It was handed down after Thurgood Marshall, who is now one of the Supreme Court judges, had many times, I think he had gone before the Supreme Court some 19 or 20 times and finally won that case. There was the upsurge of young people who did not feel that they should take the pressure and humiliation that we had taken. There was a murder of Emmett Till in August of 1955 in Mississippi. Quite an uprising from that because when at the first great mass meeting we had of the NAACP, when Dr. T.R.M. Howard came from Mississippi to speak about the Till case. So on there were several developments, and then in Montgomery especially, there were a number of individuals that I knew personally who had suffered humiliation. If it wasn't on the bus, it was some other means. I remember a young student left Georgia and came back to Montgomery, just quit college and came back to Montgomery after this started to work in the movement. And he said that he can recall when he was a small boy, about 7 or 8 years old, he was walking along the street in Montgomery and some white person walked up to him without a word and slapped his face. And of course he never forgot it. And the many individuals who did in the community felt that if one person could take a stand and they knew that it was not an isolated case because they had suffered themselves. And I believe that had something to do with it. And the fact that in my case I was not arrested for disorderly conduct, anything but the segregation, and that because I had worked over this period of years with people in Montgomery, because during the time when I first started with NAACP back in the early 1940s, we had so many cases of brutality, sometimes murder, sometimes flogging, sometimes being driven from their homes. And I was on call if anybody needed me to say something or write up a report or whatever, if they would have the courage to sign it. And I had been known in the community to come to the rescue of people when sometimes others didn't, along with Mr. Nixon, of course, because he would have me to do much of the work that he and I investigated a number of cases together that were almost unbelievable. I wouldn't like to even mention to you some of the things that I had to undergo and experience that had happened to other people.
Yeah, Mrs. Parks, you are most certainly a profile in courage. I thank you and I thank God for you. One of the things I wish that you would say to this audience today is what are the factors which caused you to have the courage? I think that is the factor which is so often missing and in people, and it causes them to not do what they know they should do. For the benefit of the people here, especially the young people, will you just tell us some of the things which caused you to have the courage to do what you did?
Well, if it hadn't been evident before, the only thing that I can go back to the time when I was a child, about 6 years old, when the Ku Klux Klan were active in our community in the rural area in Lower Montgomery County. And we never knew if they were coming in, and my grandfather was a cripple, and he was in very poor health, as well as my grandmother. My mother and my brother and I were living in this house, and of course he was always on watch to not be caught asleep if the Klan should break into our home. And of course at that time we knew nothing of nonviolence and turning the other cheek, because he had his shotgun ready. And I sat up with him all night, and I still have a chronic insomnia from some of the things I lived through when I was a child. That is not actually happening, but knowing that they happened to other people. And again, as I say, when I got married, I married a man so he and I stayed up many a night and didn't sleep at all because we did not know, because of his involvement with the infamous Scottsboro case, whether our house would be broken into. And when he left home, I did not know whether he'd be brought in or hear him lying in the street dead someplace. And it was just my mother was a woman of courage herself, because if I have a moment to mention this little incident, once she and I were on the bus together, and we went almost to the back of the bus, and there were several seats. It was on Sunday too. We were just coming from church. there were several vacant seats up front, but when she went even with the rear door of the bus and saw a vacant seat, she sat down. The person who was sitting next to the window was a white soldier, serviceman. So he became very irate when she sat down, and he asked her, he stood up and she did too. He asked her if she was going to sit there. She said, "Yes, I am." He said, "What if I threw you out the window?" And I just looked at him. I wondered if he thought I was going to stand up there and let him throw my mother out of the window. So it so happened that she looked him straight in the eye and smiled and told him he wouldn't. She said, "You're not going to do that." And she not only spoke that way at that time, I can remember several occasions, even down in the rural area of Pine Level, Alabama, where we were living, that if anybody approached her, she'd just tell them very nicely what they were not going to do, and they didn't. And in the back of the bus at this time, there was a very deep bass brother's voice who came and said if the bus driver put his hands on my mother, he was hanging his knife in his throat. And I don't know whether it was her being firm and gentle, what he said, but he moved on up front. And he was so angry he wouldn't even sit in one of the vacant seats in the front. However, I suppose if you live through this type of experience, such an incident as just getting arrested and being going off the bus with the policeman doesn't look as bad as some things might have in the past. Of course, there are other things I could mention, but I try to not bring out some of the inhuman and cruel and oppressive things that I've lived through, because I do not want people to become embittered. I want people to look forward with hope, with optimism and love and goodwill for all.
First of all, I'd like to say welcome to Cleveland from the Coalition of Labor Union Women. And I would like to know if you can give us any ideas, advice on what we can do in the future to try and get ERA, which is something we need desperately.
Well, that has been a long-standing and still defeated issue. And since it is in the hands of the government officials, Congress, President, and so on, I would suggest that we elect those officials who would support ERA nationwide.
Mrs. Parks, we'll introduce a terribly complicated subject, and you don't have to give us a lecture on it. Here's the question. I think people generally, both blacks and whites, are disappointed at the results of the move to desegregate our schools. I don't know whether you share that disappointment, but whether you do or not, do you think there is an alternative that might do for us what we hoped that desegregation would do?
Well, I certainly feel that if people would not think in terms of segregation and desegregation or integration, but just permit those who are available for education to admit them and let them be educated to their potential, I feel as long as we make a racial issue, it will ever grow and not be eliminated from our society.
I'm so interested on that day when you knew you were supposed to give your seat to a white man. What went through your mind when you, before that, what made that the day that you decided that this is the time you were going to say no?
Well, first of all, I didn't think I was supposed to give my seat to a white man just because the driver said so. And second, it was a daily and all-time confrontation if I met such bus drivers. So in fairness to the bus drivers of Montgomery, all of them did not practice this type of humiliation, oppression about standing up, because I have been on the buses even though it was the rule and the custom in the South for whites to be in the front and blacks in the back, that they would just take your fare and move on. But this particular driver did want to emphasize his power, and there was nothing in our statute books that said one passenger would have to stand up for another one to sit down. If I can remember the city ordinance correctly, I don't have the text, but it always said that seating could be rearranged, but nobody should have to give up a seat for another to stand. And I just felt, as I said before, that I did not think it was helping my condition, helping anybody else. And it was certainly not helping any of us, for 4 people to have to stand up over three vacant seats and one person taking the seat, even though the passenger did not demand or ask for the seat. He was not crippled, he was not ill.
What made you decide at that particular moment?
What I was trying to tell you, that every moment that I lived was one that I would expect, but that moment became significant because after I was arrested, the people in Montgomery stayed off the bus by the thousands, and so that was why it was focused on me as the catalyst or the beginning.
Hello again, Mrs. Parks. I'm Thomas Gray.
Hello, Thomas.
I can still hear the bombs that exploded on Martin's porch and
Yes.
Gratz in the churches. But maybe you should tell the audience about the communication that sort of helped the bus boycott to become a success from the very start by mentioning the role that the Montgomery Advertiser played, the newspaper, the Daily.
Oh, yes, there was an ongoing article, I can't recall the reporter's name, about that. And in Montgomery, on Sunday morning, the Montgomery Advertiser did print the little statement saying that had been prepared and passed out in the community about not riding the buses, and it spread the news around very well in the community. And there was also a mention made about some goon squads that were going to keep the people off the buses, and the policemen, motorcycle policemen, would follow each bus, and that also helped to keep people off the buses. So every means that was used by the press and by the officials only served to make us more determined.
Mrs. Parks, you observed during your remarks that the black-on-black crime diminished during this period of organization. Would you give us some of your feelings as to why that happened?
Well, I think it was because with the leadership that we had and the fact that the masses of people joined in, that many people who had been so frustrated they didn't know anything to do but turn against each other found a cause to be unified and to work together. And it was not just, in fact, Dr. King used to say the PhDs and no-Ds got together. And so when people came and met and talked and shared rides, regardless to their station of life or how much money they made, if they had no money, because no one was ever turned down because they didn't have money. In fact, they didn't. Many people would just come to the mass meetings and pay something to buy gasoline or whatever was needed, new tires, whatever was needed. And it was not a question of money or status or education, but just the fact that here was a cause that we would follow until changes were made for the better. And with the help from the outside, all over the country, many large cities, New York, Detroit, and I'm sure Cleveland, and many other places did support us. So we had only to keep our courage in spite of the other oppositions, the bombings and intimidations, and carry to a successful conclusion of that particular phase of our civil rights movement. Thank you very much. I see my time is up.
Standing ovation for Mrs. Parks. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. The City Club Forum is adjourned.